Hello, and welcome to this short sort of discussion about a recently published article in TRSC by my wonderful co-authors, Dr. Chadwick James-Gallaway, who's an assistant professor at Texas A&M University, Dr. Neil Shanks, who's an assistant professor at Baylor University, and myself, an assistant professor at Texas A&M University. As you can see here, the title of the piece is Uncritical Geographies of Race, a critical race discourse analysis of an online local history resource. And so today, I'd just like to highlight a few points really relevant, hopefully incredibly relevant for in-service and pre-service teachers, specifically as we try to think about the sort of often unnamed relationship between race and place or race and geography. So this article is based on original research that my co-authors and myself conducted looking at a specific website. The website is called wacohistory.org, and it's essentially a historical encyclopedia of the city of Waco that tries to catalog specific people, places, events, and things of that nature as a way to sort of understand the city's past. But our hope in doing the research was that we would highlight some insights that were relevant to folks in any place, essentially, that could help folks kind of understand how tightly connected, again, race and geography are. And one of the ways that we thought this was incredibly relevant to, social studies students and social studies educators is because we're thinking about the importance of local history, right? So oftentimes, as was my case, when we learn about history, we're learning about big, grand events and big, important places where these big historical names do really important things. And so while that's, of course, important to recognize when we're thinking about the construction of history, what that perspective often misses is how local places, the places we may be that may not be in our history textbooks or the curricular materials we're using, are also important places to think about ways that history has happened. And in that, you know, where people have made history, and we know that people are racialized, people, are assigned to categories of race. And so, again, this presents an opportunity to encourage, student investment in ways that these big grand stories about history don't always offer. And part of what we're doing in this piece is really trying to think about the real regular, what we think about here is like mundane nature of racism, how it's really active when we think about local history and regular places in ways that can often be um, construed as extraordinary, but in actuality, looking at the history of a place are very average, very ordinary. And so some of what we're trying to do here, some of this highlighted language is really just to show how researchers and scholars have been kind of talking about the ways that race or racial identity is typically something that is afforded to people of color. So that's another way to say you have a race if you're not white, if you're a person of color. Excuse me, which is also to say that white people often get seen as raceless. And when we think about the intersection of place and race, that means that the effect of whiteness on a place is often something that we don't think about, we don't talk about, and something that kind of gets papered over. And so our attempt in this article was to sort of unveil those connections so we have a better understanding of how people's actions and their racial identities really impact and shape the places or geographies that we end up studying historically, and how those histories have come to really influence the way we understand a place today. Um, so just zooming through here for the broad intentions of the article, we approached this study as a qualitative study. So we use critical race discourse analysis, which is basically a merger of critical geographies of race and critical race theory. excuse me, which is a merger of critical race theory and critical geographies, which is really what we think about when we talk about critical geographies of race. We had two questions that guided the study. Um, how does the website that I mentioned, wacohistory.org, address systemic racial power? And how does wacohistory.org characterize the city of Waco and its history relative to systemic racial power? And as I suggested earlier, our findings showed that the website overwhelmingly deracialized Waco's geography by employing whiteness as universal to describe spatial access. To state that a little bit more plainly, we basically found that the website, wacohistory.org, which is here, downplayed that race has historically determined spatial access. And so by downplaying that relationship, the website acknowledged race when it was describing spaces or places that were occupied by people of color, but that same recognition was not extended to white people. And so by de-racializing white people, they attributed race only to those who lacked whiteness. And so, in only racializing part of the population, we showed that these approaches deny the significance of racial power in Waco's history, and they trivialize the experiences of racially oppressed groups. Because to only acknowledge that racially marginalized people have a race or are racialized, you are erasing the forces, historical forces, social forces, economic forces that have allowed the group that apparently doesn't have a race to maintain that power because their race is invisible or normalized. They're seen as normal without race, and everyone else is seen as abnormal because you have a race. So these dynamics aren't just sort of floating in the ether. We start to see them really clearly when we're looking at places and spaces, geographies, because especially historically in the South and places like Waco, these racial categories determine who could and could not enter or access certain places, which has significant impact on the way people could live their lives and the resources that they had access to. And so um, we go through and provide a little bit of background on the city of Waco. We talk a little bit about, what social studies scholars and geography scholars have sort of examined already, or kind of what we know about some of the topics that are related to our article. But for the purposes here, thinking about pre-service and in-service teachers, what we really want folks to think critically about, again, for the sake of sounding redundant, is just these very kind of intricate relationships between race and geography, or race and place, because although it's not necessarily something that we think about, um, I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, can think about a specific place that we know maybe is from a place we grew up, our hometown, and we can probably tell in our minds or associate it with a group of people. That group of people, in many cases, is probably racialized a particular way. And so that's no accident. Our article is demonstrating that that's no accident. And so, to increase the racial literacy or the critical racial literacy of our students and ourselves, it's really important to pay attention to those connections and start to think about, what influence, how they came to be in the moment that they were constructed in the past, and then their influence on us today. So again, we just kind of go through the theory, which for the sake of this discussion is just really thinking about how there's a racial production of space. So race influences how spaces are constructed. And at the same time, space is racially constructed. So these two ideas of race and space are in kind of like a mutual relationship, shaping each other um, in very clear and tangible ways that we have to train ourselves to pay attention to. So as we get down into sort of some of our findings specifically, I'll highlight a couple here, just for the sake of explaining sort of how we got to our conclusions. So you'll see the category of all the entries that we examined. As I noted, there was a total of 200, and we categorized them into like three kind of broader sort of themes or categories. About a quarter, or 27%, were um, like a people or a person, community, or an organization, um, more than, was at 2/3 or so, 63%, almost 2/3 were a place. And then the remaining 10% were like a specific event, a process, or a presence. And so getting into the technicalities of how we looked at how the website sort of treated race, place, and power, we created four categories here of levels of criticality, which really were determined by the extent to which the people who are active in the entry, the people mentioned in the entry, are racialized. Or do we know what racial group they belong to? Um, and then, if if they are racialized, if they're identified as belonging to a racial group, um, is the racial separation or segregation or inequality that's mentioned in the entry, is it discussed on a structural level? So we understand the systems and institutions and structures that are responsible for the inequity. That would be a critical entry. We didn't find any entries to be critical. If it was almost critical, those actors were racialized and the inequality was discussed merely on an individual level. So we didn't necessarily get an understanding of the structures put in place to oppress folks, but it was acknowledged that folks did have race and there was an equity. For entries that we identified, and excuse me, almost critical entries were about 8.5% of the total 200. For slightly critical entries, we saw about 26 or 13%. And this is where actors are racialized or the space is racialized. Um, and there's a quick note about racial separation or inequality, but there's no explanation for why that inequality exists. So it prevents those reading from really understanding why, folks are either racialized in this way or the consequences of such. And then for critical, uncritical entries, which was the vast majority of the 200, 157 or almost 80%, these entries failed to racialize spatial or place-based access because they failed to mention race altogether. So we couldn't get to separation or segregation or inequality at all because we don't know who belongs to which race. So that was really kind of like an entry point for whether or not we could even identify the forces of inequality at work that help us more clearly understand the relationship between race and place. Um, so we go through some specific examples with language from the entries here, just showing how, I mean, the uncritical erasure is probably one of the most obvious because the entire entry won't racialize anyone. The entry's written as if the language is relevant and describes all Wacoans in this case, which we know not to be true, in part because of historical evidence, and also because most of these entries are written about a time in history when it was legally prohibited to be able to inhabit or be in the same place, like for racial mixture to happen in certain events or places. And so we point that out here and highlight that we can't even understand those relationships because we don't know who belongs to which race. One example here is the Baylor Homecoming Parade, which starts in 1909, but there's no mention of the racial identity of the folks at the parade, which we find really concerning because Baylor didn't integrate or desegregate until the 1960s. So most of these entries are about white people enjoying the parade, but we don't know that. It's written as if all Wacoans were able to participate as proverbial alumni when Black people were literally barred from the university until the 1960s. So we find that to be a really important detail that would help make more accurate the entry, but is missing. For those that we found to be slightly critical, again, for the example here of the LMSJ, it's the entry defines this organization and this place as a Mexican community sort of mutual aid hall, place of celebration, but there's no explanation offered for the social oppression that forced U.S. Mexicans to have to create and supplement their livelihoods. So we don't know why it is that this group had to come together and provide one another, support, which is again more accurate than not racializing the community at all or identifying their ethnicity or that their nationality, but it still doesn't provide us enough evidence or understanding of the ways that again that race and place come together to influence the experiences of this community. And then for those that we found to be almost critical but dismissive, which was the smallest, well, not the smallest, because there were none that we found to be critical, but one of the smaller categories, 8%, we saw an entry on Dr. Vivian Lucille Malone Mays, who ended up being Baylor's first Black professor, Black tenure professor. Um, but the entry, notes that she drank from a water fountain that was designated for white folks in 1936 when she was 4, and goes on to talk about, her schooling, her exceptional achievement, but no mention is made of the fact that, she schooled in the Jim Crow South or Jane Crow South in her case, when at a time when she didn't have access to most schools, right? She only had access to schools that were segregated Black schools. And so that crucial detail is an important part of her story because without it, we can't really understand fully why she made the decisions she made to move to certain places to have access to opportunities that she could not access if had she decided to stay in Waco. Um, and so again, those key details are small, but they help really broaden understanding of the larger forces at play that show that really tight connection again between race and place or race and geography. And so, one of the tasks that we had to take on in trying to get this article ready for publication and responding to reviewers, and I'm just zooming here, so excuse me, is to try to take some of the entries and revise them to show what a critical entry could look like. And so we ended up adding about 100 words to the entry on Vivian Malone Mays to show that you don't have to add a lot of language. You don't have to lengthen an article significantly to improve its clarity and its accuracy in order to understand. Again, I cannot stress enough this link between race and place. And so you'll see here, this language is bolded. And really, it just underlines the legal maneuvers, right? The institutional legal maneuvers that shaped Dr. Malone Mays's chances, her opportunities, the resources she had access to. And so again, it just gives a fuller, more robust picture of why her life looked the way it did and how race and place came together to shape her opportunities. We also note quickly in talking about the Baylor Homecoming Parade that it simply needed to point to the fact that Baylor's desegregation timeline did not begin until the 1960s. So until the 1960s, Baylor was an adamantly non-Black institution. And so therefore, in discussions about alumni homecoming parades, we need to note that so folks get a clearer sense of racially who's incorporated, who can be a participant, and who is not. And so again, if we're thinking about what an exercise like this could look like in the context of a classroom, it wouldn't take a lot of effort to go to some equivalent of a website like this for any place or space geography, if it's a certain city or county, and find, even if it's an encyclopedia, and find some entries where folks are trying to discuss significant people or places and have students sort of look at, oh, is the racial identity of these folks mentioned? And if so, how did their racial identity shape, the places they were in, which places they had access to, and which places were off limits to them? And so starting to think about that in the past can help influence how we associate specific racial groups with specific places now in local places that we're very, very familiar with. Um, so thank you for your time. And I hope to feel free to reach out to me via email or my co-authors, and we'd be happy to discuss this further.